Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see you, albeit via Zoom. I do feel that the topic on preaching at one level is as immediate as any of the other topics that we've addressed over the course of the year, because we have to do it every single Sunday. And as we know, Sunday's always coming. But this year has felt, on some of the things that we've addressed, safe church stuff, updates on the COVID restrictions and all of those sorts of things have felt a lot more immediate and urgent in that space. So I trust that some of what I'll have to share, at one level, probably would have been more helpful in March when we were all figuring out how to preach to a camera. But nonetheless, I hope this will be helpful for you as you think about your own preaching and particularly preaching into next year. And basically what I want to do is I want to take you through, I'm just going to share a screen here so you can see the sorts of things I'm working through. I just thought I'd call this finding some rhythm in the pulpit. I think that one of the big challenges that preachers face is figuring out how to be yourself in the pulpit, figuring out a rhythm that works for you, both in preparation and delivery and all of those sorts of things. So I'm going to share a few thoughts in this space, and then I'll just open it up for some questions and go from there. Trust it'll be helpful for you. For those of you who are unaware, I've been at Gymea for a little over 20 years now. I've been preaching fairly regularly in that period of time. For the last, I think it might be 8 or 9 years, I've taught preaching at Moreland College, the last few with Mike Frost, which has been great. Did some further study in that area as well. So I try to think a bit about this stuff a bit. And like many of you, I've got developing preachers who I work with, whether they be lay preachers or other staff members. And so always trying to think about what might be helpful. So again, I'll share some of this stuff and we'll see how you go. But essentially, there are 4 things I think are really helpful for finding some rhythm in the pulpit. And they are being aware of the creative process, keeping your bucket full, keeping it simple, and then ditching the manuscript. And so I want to talk about each of those very briefly. And then, as I said, take a few questions at the end. But I think these are some of the things that have been, I think, most helpful for me in my preaching. And I think tend to have some of the biggest impact in the preaching of others. So let me begin. Let me begin by talking a little bit about the creative process. This comes from a book entitled Living with the Creative Mind by Jeff and Julie Crabtree. It's not a preaching text. It's simply about how you live with people who are artistic and creative. My wife's an artist. It's her painting that's behind me. And someone gave it to me thinking that it might be helpful for our marriage. Not that there was any problems with our marriage, but I think that was the intention behind it. But as I was reading the book, it proved to be far more helpful for my preaching than for my marriage. And that's essentially because as they began to describe the creative process, there was a real resonance for me with what I engage with every single week. I'm not sure if you've ever thought about it, but preaching is a creative act. We are trying to come up with, even if you just think about it in terms of a 20-minute speech, we're trying to come up with something like that in a way that's engaging and creative every single week. And it explained to me some of why I found preaching sometimes easy. Some weeks, you write a sermon, it just kind of rolls off the fingertips or rolls off the pen. It's easy. And other weeks, it was just so hard. And while some of that might have been spiritual, while some of that might have been the overall stress of the week or whatever it might be, some of it's also simply for the fact that what we're doing is creative. And their process, and they use the lava lamp, for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. They talk about 3 things, perception being the first, which is when you get the spark of an idea. So in the sermon preparation, you read the text the first time, okay, I'm preaching on Psalm, I think it's 85 in a couple of weeks. And so you open it up and you read the text through and you kind of go, oh, and you think of an illustration right away. You think of an immediate direction, or an application becomes really clear, or there's another text that comes, whatever it might be. You have this perception. You have an idea that you think might turn into something. The next stage, though, is discovery. In the discovery stage is when you basically try to work out whether any of your perceptions were actually any good, right? We've all had that. You write down a handful of great ideas, and then you actually start doing some research in the text. You actually start thinking about it a little bit. You start playing around with the needs of your congregation, how much time you have, whatever it might be. And you realize, actually, some of those perceptions are valuable, some of them are not. And the third then is production. And again, this was really helpful because what they pointed out was that the production, the creativity at the end is actually part of the process, but it's the end of the process. And what's so useful about this, this idea of a creative process is their recognition that a process can be stalled, initiated, restarted, and it's not linear. So they use the example of a lava lamp. You know, you've all seen lava lamps, or at least in movies, right? And things kind of float to the top, and then they gradually float to the bottom, and something else floats to the top. And that's the creative process. You can't sit there and say, okay, I'm going to have a whole bunch of perceptions right now, and then I'm going to be done with perceptions, and I'm going to move to the discovery phase, and then I'm going to produce my sermon. We all know how it works, don't we? You have an idea initially in the text, and you start thinking about it, and you get a new perception, which changes your whole sermon. Or you've done all the perception, all the discovery, you start working through your text, start working through your sermon, and you realize you've got way too much material. Or that your second point is actually the point, you need to drop everything else, and you kind of go back to the start. And while that, I think the messiness of the creative process is really helpful to be aware of. You know, one of the questions that, Mike and I think would field nearly every semester in a preaching class is, how do you prepare a sermon? I can tell you my general process, and I'll share a little bit of that later on. I can talk about the sorts of things that I'll do, but week in, week out, some weeks it looks very, very different. I can tell you what I start to do, but it's the creative process that usually gets in the way. And some weeks, I don't know about you, but every so often, I'll be looking at a passage and I think to myself, there's nothing in this passage, right? The word of God might all be, spirit breathed and useful, but I can't see any of it in this passage, right? There are other weeks where you look at a passage, doesn't matter how obscure, and it just all kind of comes like a bolt of lightning. And just being aware of the messiness of the creative process, I found really freeing. Just kind of go, you know what? It's okay. So if I'm working through the production stage, right, I'm trying to write my sermon, and it's just not working, I can actually go back to the discovery stage. I can start rethinking some other things. I might try to think about a different way to do the sermon. It doesn't have to be so linear. So I think that's really helpful, just to be aware of the creative process. And then that means, I think, again, students will often ask, how long do you take to write a sermon? How long's a piece of string, right? Again, some weeks you only have an hour to prepare a sermon, right? Because the week is blown up and that's all you've got. Well, there you go. It's an hour. Sometimes you've got a lot of space in your week and you can take a leisurely 8 to 10 hours to work through a text or more. Some weeks it all flows really easily. Some weeks 40 hours is not nearly enough to even come close to having something that's preachable, right? So my advice generally is take the time that you're given, whatever time you have. Do you have 2 hours? Use all 2 hours. You got 6 hours? Use all 6 hours. Whatever time you have, use it. Because when you're talking about the gestation period of something creative, you want to give it as much time as you can, right? You want to allow things to incubate. You want to allow things to steep, to marinate, to cure and to age. And while we tend to not to have quite enough time to allow a sermon to truly cure, I think we do want to give it as much time as we have, right? And then I think outside of that, be aware that in creativity, and this was the other really helpful thing out of their book, again, it's by Jeff and Julie Crabtree, Living with the Creative Mind, published out of Manly, I believe it was. But they talk about the tides of creativity, that there are certain tides in our lives where we might be, say, focused more on the outside world, and other times where we're focused more on our internal world. There are times when we are, even if I just think about it like this, there are times that you're in the zone. If you're in the zone, like writing a sermon is a piece of cake, right? but you've all been out of the zone. I'm not sure what that's called, but you know those times when it's just a slog. It is hard to resist the tide when you are tired, when you're feeling stressed. It's hard to resist the tides of the other concerns in our lives. And so just be aware that creativity does come and go a little bit. There are moments when you are more open to the production, more open to perception, more open to discovery. Just I'll say this again later on. Be kind to yourself when you're preparing sermons, and just be aware of the creative process and the messiness of it. And that, I think, frees us from feeling like we have to kind of robotically move our way through a text. There's times when it's easy and there are times when it's not. And sometimes it just comes down to the creative process. So that's the first piece. The second is related. Keep your bucket full. And essentially, this is all about self-care. One of the things that Crabtree and Crabtree discuss is the importance of self-care for creativity. We all know this. If you are exhausted and you sit down to write a sermon, good luck to you, right? Or God bless you, I should probably be the better way to describe that, right? Theologically accurate, right? Like if you are exhausted, like, you know, you can look at the text. It's the living word of God. The Spirit is at work in you, and you're just reading it 4 or 5 times. You don't even know you read, right? So we do need to take care of ourselves as best we can. And so that means being, you know, just generally sleep, diet, exercise. There's something really valuable. I'll occasionally just go walk around the block here just to kind of clear my head. It takes about 15 minutes, just, you know, pretty casual walk. You could probably do it a lot quicker. I'm not walking for fitness. I'm just walking to kind of clear my head, but just moving can be really helpful. There are times when, even though I know that later in the week is going to feel really short, it's better for me to go home a little bit early and rest than it is for me to kind of press on for another 45 minutes or an hour and basically get nothing done and feel crappy about myself because I haven't got anything done. So just be aware of that. I think specific care, what fills your bucket? Like, where does your creativity stem from? You know, I think we've all met people, and maybe you're one of them, you know, for whom just watching movies just sparks all sorts of stuff in you. Different ideas, the stories are what really move you. So whether it's novels or movies or television shows, whatever it might be. For some of you, it's just having some time by yourself. That fills your bucket up. For some of you, it might be hanging out with some friends and not talking, but what fills your bucket? And make sure that you got enough fuel in the tank, you got enough water in the bucket to be able to be creative, because being creative out of deficit is nearly impossible. You've got to be able to care for yourself, to have that regular influence of creativity. So I find, you know, one of the things that fills my bucket is I quite enjoy learning quite generally, but I like reading books on social culture and history. I find that just really fascinating. It's not related at all to what I do. It very rarely finds its way into a sermon, but it energizes me, helps me to see the world differently, to think about the world differently in ways that don't require me to necessarily change. So I read The History of Salt by Marc Kurlansky, I think it was. It's fascinating. It was just a fascinating history. Now, you know, I think I may have mentioned it in a sermon just because it was just such a great text, but I didn't have to do anything about it. I didn't change my eating habits. I just appreciated that I knew a little bit more about the world I lived in and saw the world a little bit differently. And it just kind of sparked some creativity. And that's a really valuable thing. So know what fills your bucket and make sure you're doing that. And then be kind to yourself. I think one of my reflections of preachers, particularly developing preachers, but I suspect it happens everywhere, is that we tend to be pretty hard on ourselves about the kind of sermons that we preached, or, you know, whether it was any good or all that kind of stuff. And I think it's important to be kind to yourself. And I guess the summary of that for me is preach for average, not a score. Right? We've all had Sundays where, I know I have, where you kind of sit down at the end of a sermon and you think to yourself, I should probably just hand my paycheck back this week and be done with it. And then I'll feel we'll about it, and we'll just forget about it. Keep in mind that you do preach for average, You won't be judged for your best sermon. You probably won't be judged for your worst sermon, right? The point is your average slowly increasing, right? That's the stuff that kind of matters. And so if you have one of those weeks where it's just like, I don't know. I don't think I've got anything here. Preach it. Just preach it and trust that God will be at work in it. And just, kind of just be kind to yourself. There are very few people who have to do presentations like we do every single week. It's a really unique gift mix. And I reckon that lots and lots of people who present regularly in the corporate world could learn a lot from preachers about rhythms and patterns and processes. And so be kind to yourself in what we're doing. Really, really quite significant in the midst of all of that. Then thirdly, keep it simple. Just don't make preaching more complicated than it has to be. So here's a few things. Preach to your strengths. Are you good at telling stories? Then work hard at telling stories. Are you good at finding lots of small little illustrations? Then find lots of small illustrations. Is application the thing that really gets your blood going? Then apply the word. Work to your strengths, because what that does is it's a form of being kind to yourself. I think we all know our weaknesses. We all know the areas where we can improve, and there's a time and a place to improve in those areas where we're not as strong. But focus on your strengths. You know what you're good at. Work at that. Do that more, because the things that we're good at, it's also easier to engage in because we enjoy what we're good at, right? Even if we only feel it internally, right? There's that sense of this is valuable. So go for it. In your preparation, choose your rabbit holes carefully. A rabbit hole is, you're reading a text and you stumble upon something, whether it's in the text or perhaps in the original languages or in the commentary, that sparks your imagination and drags you off on what you hope might be a digression, which will eventually bring you back to your sermon, or which more often than not turns into a tangent, which kind of wanders off in the forest somewhere and dies, right? That's the difference between a digression and a tangent, right? And rabbit holes are really energizing because something's grabbed your attention and now you want to learn about it. The issue that we have to grapple with is, while there's the energizing aspect of going down the rabbit hole and finding a lot more out about a particular thing, it can sometimes drag our whole sermon off target or off course. So just be careful which ones you follow and chase down, and learn a little bit of self-discipline to say, okay, this is really interesting. I'm going to come back to it because it's actually nowhere near the point that I'm trying to drive home in this text, and set it aside. So just be very careful about that. I think that I find rabbit holes fascinating. So I once spent a very happy 2 or 3 hours reading about wells in the ancient world. I just dug up all these articles that I could find online about wells in the ancient world. It was just amazing. I never really thought about the fact that you'd have wells in the town and whether they were guarded and how expensive they were, and all these sorts of things. None of that made it into my sermon. It was just a really nice 2 or 3 hours that I got to spend down a rabbit hole learning about something that had grabbed my attention. Really refreshing and energizing, not really helpful for the text as for the sermon that I was actually trying to write. So just be aware of that. Aim for wholesome food, not a degustation menu. Food imagery is used a lot in the homiletic literature. And I think it's Robert Farrar Capon who basically says, what our congregations need is the homiletic equivalent of meat and 2 veg, right? They just need something wholesome. They need to be introduced to the word. They need to be introduced to the truth. They need to be pointed towards Jesus. They need to be given a step or two to take. That's the deal. They don't need the homiletically equivalent of, I think he talks about souffled something or other, and roasted water chestnuts and all that kind of stuff. Just stick with it, right? Now, there's times when we'll be able to do something special for our congregations, right? We'll have more energy, more time, a particular passage or text, inspiration from the Spirit. It all combines to make this wonderful special meal. But most of the time, just aim for wholesome food. Carl Fays, who I used to work with, would often say that he reckoned that preachers are often preaching not to their congregation, but to their college lecturers. That they're seeking to impress someone who's not necessarily there. You may have a college lecturer in your church, God bless you. But the idea of preaching to those who know the text better than we do. The reality is you will have spent more time in the particular text that you're focused on preaching this week than nearly all of your congregation. They're probably not going to read a lot of commentaries. It'd be very rare if people did. They're not going to spend as much time thinking and praying and considering how this passage might be explained or explored. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. You are aiming just to help people move a little bit closer to God, take faithful steps forward. And that doesn't have to be so we don't need quite as much pressure on ourselves as we sometimes put. And I think the other thing about keeping it simple is variation of voice. Whether this be inviting guests, so there are literally different voices in the room. I think that it's also valuable to change up our structures from time to time without putting too much pressure on keeping it simple, because a new structure can feel not simple at all, but quite complex. But just vary the ways in which you are preaching, who's preaching, the sorts of passages that you're preaching, a good mixture of, Old Testament and New Testament and topical preaching and theological stuff. A good variation can be helpful to keep us engaged and keep our congregations engaged as well. And then finally, perhaps the most practical of them is ditch the manuscript. If you hear nothing more from what I'm saying today, this is the thing to keep in mind. If you use a full manuscript to preach, stop it. That's my advice to you. And I would say that this is especially true because I know that there are various types of manuscripts, how full it is versus kind of more bullet points and all that sort of stuff. But if you are prone to writing a text, a manuscript, and then editing the manuscript and really editing it over and over again, then I think it's really important to stop. Because what you end up doing is you end up you edit the manuscript, and then you can't remember when you're presenting which manuscript you are preaching. And all of those changes, all of those edits get all mixed up in your head, and they keep you from being able to clearly present your sermon, right? And I think you know this, but a full manuscript inhibits presence. I think this is one of the challenges of preaching to a camera. If you have a camera, there's already a screen, as there is right now, between me and you. I'm speaking into my computer and you are watching on your computer. So we're trying to bridge two screens gap here. But if I were reading all of this, if I had some sort of a manuscript and I was looking down and then looking up and then looking down and then looking up, it's one more inhibiting factor for me being as present as I can be in the moment. And that's also true when we're face to face. And so whenever there's something between me and you, it's not just that there's a piece of paper that I'm looking at. There's also a psychological distance. I'm not as present with you because I am retreating behind the manuscript. And the manuscript is what I am focused on, not on you. Because I can't be. I have to follow my manuscript or I'm going to get lost. And so that inhibits the presence that we can have with our congregation in the moment, in the midst of what happens with the Spirit. I think a manuscript is also really labor intensive. That's a lot of work. I think one of the reasons people take such a long time to prepare sermons is often because they're writing a manuscript. And then I think finally it's oral rather than oral, right? It's written for the ear. Sorry, it's written for the eye, not for the ear, right? I think we've all, I can often, when I'm listening to recordings, now most of the time now, my students give me a video, so I get to watch what's happening. But when it would just be audio, I can hear the change in their presentation when people got off script. I could tell you exactly when someone stopped reading their manuscript and started telling the story that they knew. There's just a change in how they present, and it was obvious just listening to the audio. So when we're preparing something orally, it's just a very different preparation. I don't know if you've ever had someone transcribe a sermon for you. I had to present a I had to submit a sermon for something, and so I had someone transcribe one of my sermons, and I read it, and it was brutal to read. It was absolutely brutal because I was repeating myself. I just said the same thing over and over again in slightly different ways, and reading it, I'm kind of like, oh, Mark, just get to the point. But an oral presentation, it made perfect sense. And so just be aware that a manuscript does, as Marshall McLuhan say, right? The medium is the message. It shapes the way we communicate in really powerful ways. Now, I think a lot of people are fearful of this. So let me just say, you need to trust yourself and the Spirit of God. Back yourself. I don't know the number of times people have said to me, oh, I don't want to preach heresy. And I'm like, how many heresies are you going to, like, how many are you almost going to preach? Like, didn't you go to Bible college? Right, you're the one with the degree. You're not going to preach a heresy. Just relax, trust yourself, and trust that the Spirit of God can work in the midst of that. And here's just a proposed methodology. What I used to do, I still do it occasionally, although not as frequently, is I would prepare my sermons in PowerPoint. So I'd open up a PowerPoint, and in the notes section at the bottom, I would essentially write a full manuscript. I would basically type out exactly kind of what I wanted to say. It would be pretty rough. It would be kind of a little bit, pitched for the ear rather than the eye, but it would be a written manuscript. And then when I got, I don't know, maybe 200 words, maybe less, I never really counted, enough for a slide, I would transfer that information into 3 or 4 points in the PowerPoint slide. And then I'd go to the next slide and keep typing and then transfer the points until I had the whole sermon done. But then when I began to edit the sermon, I almost never edited the full text. I only edited the points, which meant that the editing process was a little bit simpler, and I was able to work through the points themselves and work for flow. I'd already written it out, so I already knew kind of the big picture that I wanted to use. I could actually go back in and make sure that I got a quote right or whatever it might have been. But it did allow me to cut down on the editing and then just practice not a full manuscript, but the points, but I had all the stuff there anyways. I don't know if that's helpful for you, but I found that pretty useful moving forward. And then finally, in terms of ditching the manuscript, little steps are fine. So if you think to yourself, okay, I'm gonna use a smaller manuscript, or I'm gonna use expanded bullet points or whatever, that's fine. But can I encourage you to take the leap? I had a student once, and I kind of kept up with her after college. And at one point I said to her, all right, the next sermon you preach, you cannot use a manuscript. And she looked at me aghast, and she's like, what do you mean? And I said, you can't use a manuscript. Now, I had absolutely no authority to say that. There's no reason why she needed to believe me or do what I said. But it gave her the permission to actually have a crack. So if you need that today, here it is. The next sermon you preach, don't use a manuscript. Use some points, use a handful of bullet points, 1 page, half a page, something. Take the leap. Be a little bit more present. Be just a little bit more available and in the moment, and see what God does in the midst of all that. So those are the 4 things. Be aware of the creative process. Keep your bucket full. Keep it simple. Ditch the manuscript, and hopefully that will help you find some rhythm in the pulpit. So I'll take some questions. I went probably just a shade longer than I'd hoped to, but hey, I'm a preacher, so that's how that thing works, isn't it? So I'll open it to some questions if you have some.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Hey, just unmute yourself. Don't forget to unmute yourself if you're going to ask a question, but go for it, peeps. Who's got a question for Mark?
Hello, Mark. I'm David.
Hey, David.
Can I ask one thing? So you, as you said, that you don't write in the full manuscript. You just make my understanding from you make some point, and then use your PowerPoint, and then you preach. Yeah, is it right? Yeah.
Yep, that would be what I do. Although I'd have to say that over the last several months, I've been preparing a PowerPoint, just the points. And then essentially I'm practicing it 2 or 3 times and then preaching it right away and not really using it at all. So that but that's a process of learning to trust myself and my short-term memory. Yeah. If you ask me to do it, can you preach that sermon again a day later? It'd be like, no. So I do tend to trust things in short-term memory. Yeah.
at the beginning of my preaching ministry, maybe a long time ago, when I became maybe youth pastor or young adult pastor at the time, I prepare full script, and then I just follow full script rather than eye contact with the audience. But it was helpful. But after maybe 5 years, 10 years preaching, I think it's still I like to that write down all a script, but I don't see in a script. Rather, I just see the audience and then with eye contact, and then it's what I'm doing at the moment. Do you think that still okay? Because I've just write down a full script, but I don't see in a script. But like this. But,
I think the issue is for each of us is to figure out how we can be present. Right. So I know a few preachers who use scripts, like Tim McBride will still use a pretty full script. He works very hard though at that presence piece. But I think you know when you're present with a group of people, right? Because there's some energy between you. You can feel the energy. I think as believers, we believe that some of that is the gathered people of God, along with the power of the Holy Spirit. There's this energy in the midst of that where I'm speaking what I prepared. I'm not just making stuff up. I've prepared this, but I am present. I'm able to kind of see your reactions. I'm able to watch your body responses. I'm able to see the nods and sense the engagement and to feel those moments when, I actually need to press this harder than I had prepared. You need to work out how you can be as present as you can be. And I just find that when I've asked students or asked staff or told staff, although I'm not sure I can really do this, don't use a manuscript, they are always more present. They're always more present. Yes, there's that sense of them kind of remembering what they're doing, but they're present and engaged in the moment because there's nowhere else to look. They have nowhere else to retreat to. And there's something really engaging about that for people. So you need to work out how that works best for you. And I think, David, your point is right. I think people often start with the manuscript. And at one level, I think, that's kind of comfortable. But it very quickly becomes our default and becomes a bit of a security blanket. So I would probably encourage students now, don't use a manuscript. Even if you write one out, make sure it's bullet points that you preach from to free yourself from that as quickly as you can so that you can be as present as you can.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm interested to know, do you use a PowerPoint when you preach as in presentation?
No, we don't. We used to. And then when I became senior pastor and was flat chat and was preaching most weeks, I just didn't have time to kind of come up with the fancy images and all that sort of stuff. And so we just kind of dropped them and nobody complained and we've never gone back. So we'll generally just have the kind of a title slide and occasionally we'll have one or two slides. Yeah.
So
now
do you put up Bible verses?
No, we don't even do that. Now, I know that for those of you who have multicultural, particularly non-English speaking congregations or English as a second language, some of the feedback that I've heard is that makes it really difficult. They need a little more help to kind of follow along. And so some pastors will actually prepare a manuscript and give it to people so they can read it along. So I understand that there's more dynamics in the midst of all of that. Bible verses would be very helpful in that space as well. But in a kind of if you have a sense of a kind of a homogenous group of English speakers, I think you could probably get away with that. I just found it was time consuming, Rob.
Yeah, I agree. No problem. The other thing I just want to ask is, like, given this season, just when we're doing more on camera than face-to-face stuff, and it's hard, it's impossible to read the presence of other people unless you're reading the chat at the same time if you're live. Is there something that you've noticed from feedback that gives more presence to the camera when you preach? I get the point about not using a manuscript, but anything else that you have noticed that you can do that engages people's engagement on the other side of the camera?
Yeah, I mean, most of my reflection, it's all pretty low level stuff, but I reflected on some of the YouTubers that I follow, and reflecting on, I guess, their best practice, right? So there's a guy I follow, you won't be surprised to know that he's a hockey guy, And, apart from the fact that he does like 1,000 jump cuts, so he edits everything. And so, he takes much, much longer. It's always straight down the barrel talking to you. And it's actually much more conversational than a lot of my preaching would be necessarily, right? Trying to kind of speak to a group of people who are all engaging in the midst of it, and then speaking about the you who are listening. Some of that kind of stuff has been, I think, really helpful. So I've been really aware of how important it is to look down the barrel of the camera. We experimented at one point. We actually had a couple of camera angles, and it was amazing watching how distracting it was as soon as it shifted from this view to this view. And I'm still speaking to the camera, but you're looking at the side of my face and you switched off. And so just looking right down the barrel of the camera, one shot, maybe tight and then maybe wide, but that's the most significant thing that I've come across. Because at the end of the day, through a camera, you got to be as engaged. I mean, I can be as engaging as I want to be, but you can at any point in time go make yourself a cup of tea. So I've just got to handle that. So, yeah.
And one last question, what about timing? Because like a lot of media stuff now, the essence is much shorter than longer, and people's engagement is much shorter than longer. So have you noticed any reflection on how that affects the time of the length of our sermon, and what's a good time these days to be able to preach?
Yeah, I think a time length of a sermon is a little bit contextual in terms of what your congregation is used to. But I also think that generally speaking, your reflection is dead accurate, that things on camera, things that are pre-recorded or even just kind of that you're watching streamed do need to be shorter. We were aiming when we were face-to-face at I would preach between 22, 23, 24 minutes. So I actually take my phone up, I set a timer on it to 22 and a half minutes, 23 minutes, and I basically preach to that. Once we went online, they were about between 16 and 18 minutes, somewhere in there. And that just feels right. It doesn't feel too long when you're watching it. It doesn't feel too long when you preach it, even though it's significantly shorter than what we would normally do.
Thanks.
I had a question. Just with like going off script, you have to really know your subject well and your content really well. So how do you get to know your content and your subject well enough just to be able to speak about it off script?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of this, Stephen, is about keeping it simple. We've all done this. I know I've done this heaps. We've all tried to preach 2 sermons in one. We've convinced ourselves that these 4 points all go together, and they really don't. They're 2 different sermons. One of the central practices that I engage in to help me know whether I've got it right is when I rehearse it, can I remember it? And generally speaking, if when I rehearse my sermon, if I can't remember the shift from point 2 to point 3, it's normally because it makes no sense, not even to me, right? Because a good story, if I asked you, Steve, how did you meet your wife? You don't need to sit there and remember the whole story before you can tell me the story. You just start at the beginning. Well, we met at youth group down at such and such a church. And that detail reminds you of the second detail, which is when I asked her out and we went to this youth camp. And then the third detail, and it all kind of flows on from each other. And a good sermon should really just flow on. The only thing you should really need to remember is the opening, right? Today we're looking at Psalm 85, and I want to draw your attention to 3 things. And if you can't remember those 3 things, chances are it's not your brain. Sorry, it's not your brain in the sense that you don't have a good memory. It's that your brain can't make the connections between them. And sometimes it's as simple as changing the order. I find that often is enough for me. It's like actually point 3 should be point 2, and then it makes sense. Or I just need to go back and work at that transition just a little bit harder so that it flows for me in my mind. And once that happens, that tends to be the best case for me. So I do it out loud. So that I can hear myself, because often you listen to yourself and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you talking about? You're like, I don't know. Let me go back and see what I was talking about. Oh, that's right. I don't know what I was talking about. And you can do the additional work and kind of work the transitions. But that for me seems to be one of the critical pieces.
Mark, are you saying? Sorry, I was just going to add on to it. Sorry, Steve. Are you saying, Mark, that you have no notes? Because Because didn't you say that sometimes you have points with you just to, so if you if you have that mental blank, you can go, where am I up to?
Yeah. Like when we were face to face, we had 3 services. By the evening, I'd bring my I'd bring my iPad up. I wouldn't look at it. But generally speaking, I'd barely look at it in the first 2 services either. It was probably a little bit of a security blanket for me. The last probably 6 or 7 or 8 sermons I've preached here, I haven't had any notes with me at all. I've just had my Bible and just kind of, because I've rehearsed it and just kind of, gone right into it. To some degree, that's a little bit because now I don't, what it was like, for those of you who are face to face, you finish rehearsing it in your office or wherever you're rehearsing, you kind of go downstairs and then you're bombarded by hello. First, a couple of songs of worship, announcements, whatever it might be. Whereas now I finish rehearsing, I go downstairs and I deliver it. So that's a little bit easier, but I will, I do have some notes, but I don't use a lot of them.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
This is one other question. Some people use conversational partners, like they try to, say during the week, getting conversations with people where they sort of share some of the points they want to bring up on Sunday, just to be able to talk through it. Like some people talk through their sermon with their wife or with the, or just another pastor, someone else on staff. So what do you think about that? Like, is that a useful practice to get the message into your mind?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think the more you share what you're trying to say, the clearer you get, right? It's kind of the dump and sort method of communication. I'm just going to say everything and then we'll kind of sort out what I meant, right? And the more you're able to share it, the more clarity you get on what you're trying to say. So I think that can be valuable. Laurie Carroll, Carrell, I believe, wrote a book called, I think it's Preaching for Transformation. And she recommends the creation of what she calls a sojourners group, a small group of people that rotate through where you meet and you have a bit of a conversation. It's an excellent book, by the way, really, really good. She's not a homiletician. She's not a preacher. She's a communication specialist. And she's done a whole bunch of excellent research with both congregation members and preachers about what they're trying to do. So she would recommend that kind of that opportunity to kind of speak into that space. Because if your only partner is a commentary, well, then that's going to be reflected in how you preach, right? So bouncing around people is helpful. I don't do a lot of that, in part because I'm often running too tight to the line, right? I don't know exactly what I'm saying until it's far too late to have a conversation with anybody about it, because we're good to go now, folks. So if you don't like it, we can talk later. So, but if you can be far enough ahead, by all means, I think it's valuable.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark, for your input. We're going to have to leave it there. I appreciate all that you've said, and maybe if people have still got questions, they can contact you, right, and keep chatting to you about it.
Absolutely,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.